it can get really quite complicated. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with Lightning. So, I think it's the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it's actually understandable for the audience of people who want to use it without getting too much in the weeds, like this is the first major decentralized system. And
welcome everybody. That was a little bit of Kira Bickers, who is our guest today. And thanks to everyone for joining me today with the Learning With Lowell show. This episode, we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of the crypto space, looking at the technology and sidestepping a lot of the hype, or I like to say, golden them hills type talk that is in the blockchain space sometimes. We go over a dozen different topics, looking at mental models, gold standard, the Fed, centralization, learning, China versus U.S. competition, economic policy, 1984, how crypto could help protests like the Canadian truckers be a little bit more insulated from their government, and much, much more. So I think you're going to like this episode. Let's just dive right into it. And please leave a comment or write me an email. Let me know what you think. A small one, but how has, Bitcoin impacted your life? Like from where you were going originally to where you are now, how big of a change is that in terms, if you can kind of like mind shift it?
That's a great question. I think, so I got interested in Bitcoin like it was in 2012. So I'm not quite sure how old I was then, but it was like around the Ron Paul sort of liberty movement here in the US. And I mean, I wouldn't say that my life was like totally devoid of purpose. I would say that I was always a person that felt that I had a lot of integrity, but it's kind of hard to find a career when you're autistic like that. If you have really strong political views that are basically contradicted by every area of society, like where do you go? And I think, without Bitcoin, I wouldn't have been able to like step into that integrity and work in conjunction or in alignment with my value set. So, I mean, that's a really big statement of how much Bitcoin has changed my life, but certainly more than monetarily. That's been the biggest shift. I mean, most of my social circle of close friends, I've all met through Bitcoin, which is another bizarre thing, right? And I guess social media has kind of evolved over the same amount of time. So it's much easier to find people who share your values than it was before.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like Bitcoin's kind of like where your home was.
Yeah.
Where your home is.
Yeah, I'd say so. Maybe it's a little bit chaotic, and I wouldn't say Bitcoin Twitter or anything like that would be a stable home for anyone sane. But yeah, no, I've met such a great group of people, and especially finding myself more in the technical part of the ecosystem. A lot of the developers, a lot of the cryptographers are just like really humble people that are not only cryptographers, but economists and philosophers in their own right.
That makes sense. Are there aspects of Bitcoin or blockchain technology that you're still very fascinated with understanding, that maybe like even still elude you to this day that you're still trying to like grasp with understanding it?
Yeah, absolutely. So like the Lightning Network, which is kind of a scalability proposal for blockchains, and maybe even taking a step back, it's like one of the biggest problems for blockchains is the scalability question, is like, how do you get more transactions in a decentralized system? It's a really hard problem to solve. So Bitcoin is, minimum viable decentralization and not get shut down, but, throughput is not great. So the Lightning Network is a scalability layer to Bitcoin, and there's many of these different types of competing implementations, proposals, what have you. And I don't know much about Lightning relative to the people who are working on it, I would say. I just started a newsletter called the Simple Lightning Newsletter, which is designed to help me and the audience kind of explore the technology that is Lightning and see how we can actually how we can preserve a lot of the properties of Bitcoin, primarily censorship resistance, self-sovereignty, and get more transactions. Basically, how can we make this whole thing scale into the future, and how can it still be around in 100 years?
Is it kind of, so in a couple of your videos, you discussed how like when a blockchain or cryptocurrency, I'm gonna get the terms mixed up, but I think it was a cryptocurrency, has some type of centralizing feature to like have those optimizations, it usually fails. Is Lightning some type of pseudo centralization, or is it just trying to have like an advanced networking layer on Bitcoin to make it work better?
Does it have some sort of centralization? It's sort of like, I'll answer this in a sort of circuitous way here, but it's like the problem with decentralization at large is that it's really quite expensive. And the the thing that people who are like very pro decentralization sort of begrudgingly fail to recognize at times is that there's a lot of benefits to centralization, not just reduction of costs, but also like mediation of disputes and things like that. Um, I think what cryptographers in the Lightning area are trying to experiment with is how can we do uh, dispute resolution, mediation, all trustlessly. Those are sort of like big words, maybe even buzzwords, but it's like how can we replicate what exists in payment processors without them? How do we do this in a trustless manner? How do we do this with two parties and a protocol instead of three parties and having to give over your custody?
And what does dispute resolution mean as it relates to what we're talking about?
Yeah, so like if we take Bitcoin as an example to frame what I mean with that, it's like before Bitcoin existed, what cryptographers I believe were trying to do is they were trying to obtain the same properties of cash, but in a digital sense, right? So in that sense, it's like if I hand over a digital file, I want to be sure that I haven't copied it and that it's fully yours when I hand it over. And it's like, how do you do that without an authorizing third party? And again, maybe that's a lot of words, but this dispute resolution really means like if we have a contract, how do we make sure that the rules of engagement are followed? Right. And like maybe we can take it to be a really, really simple contract, like just payments. Or maybe we take it to be a more complicated contract of like payments over time. So it can get really quite complicated. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with Lightning. So, I I think it's the cool thing about Bitcoin is that it's actually understandable for the audience of people who want to use it without getting too much in the weeds, Like this is the first major decentralized system. And I do think it's possible for people to understand. I think once you start to get into Lightning, the value proposition changes a little bit because it's so much more technical. It's maybe not worth understanding the details. It's sort of just one of those things where if it works, it's a win for all of us. and if it doesn't end up working, then you didn't waste your time trying to figure it out, I guess. But maybe I'm a little bit of a masochist that way since I'm so consumed by it.
No, I think the knowledge, like the pursuit of knowledge, especially for autodidacts, is like an obsession in and of itself. Like sometimes,
Yeah,
my wife can attest to this. Like I'll be reading something, and she'll look at me, and it looks like I'm having a heart attack. And it's like I can see how I can apply this to so many different areas. It's like yeah, I don't know. Like she says, it looks like I'm taking drugs when I'm like learning new things. So
yeah, no, I resonate with that.
yeah, so it's kind of like that. It's like Lightning, maybe esoteric in terms of its technical complexness, but it's like if you have the interest, for essentially a decade, and it's still going strong. And I think the story goes like you first bought Bitcoin because your girlfriend was tired of you speaking about it all the time. But
Yeah.
like I imagine the passion is strong. It's not, I think it's just like fun. Like it's self-reinforcing fun in terms of learning these like really, really deep technical things. And if it doesn't like have the value of learning it in and of itself, usually how you can apply it later to something else is like you'll never know how you can apply it later. That's the fun part, I think.
That's true. It's a bit of an enigma that way, right? It's like sometimes you're just drawn and compelled by the mystery of complexity, and it's you don't really know how it's going to be useful in your life, and certainly I feel that way at low level stuff. But I mean, if it's an end in itself, then it is, right? And I contemplated naming the book Bitcoin Clarity, Bitcoin, the Value of Beauty instead, but I felt like maybe that wouldn't have mainstream appeal. Yeah. But I do feel like the pursuit of building decentralized systems for the sake of censorship resistance is such a beautiful concept. And then when you actually see it implemented, it's just like layers and layers of beauty, really, to me, right? But then I, of course, sound a little bit odd when I look at technology through that lens. I don't think it's a common way to do so.
Is it like from your point of view, and maybe it's hard to see it because like you're living in it, but like if you took a step out, do you think it's like when Neo is seeing I forget his name, but he's like the trader and he's looking at the lines of code, and Neo sees the lines of code, so like everyone else is like just seeing the code, but you're like seeing like the woman in the red dress or whatever it's supposed to be.
I love that. I just saw the Matrix 4 actually. It's also I thought it was pretty good. But yeah, I mean, it's funny because with code, it's like I used to code more often, used to be an engineer, and I've sort of stepped out of that role, but I can still understand when code is beautiful, right? It's like it's beautiful in the same way a good sentence is beautiful when it's like clean and short, right? And it like punches. And it's like you can completely understand it and there's just like total clarity around it. Like that to me is beautiful code. But it's also true when you see the inverse and you're like, wow, this is like really ugly, like long spaghetti code, but it works.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just like, yeah, it's different ways of beauty, I guess.
Yeah, I've been reading more like open source repos, and so you get a little bit of both of that, both of those, both sides of that spectrum, where it's like big and ugly, but like elegant and quite nice. Where it's like I could spend a whole month trying to make something that complex, and it would probably start really ugly, and then I just like draft it over. But and it's in each one because you have so many different levels of expertise doing it, which I think that's the kind of the fun of open source, which is like a little bit of what Bitcoin and blockchain technologies I think is interesting to people, is because like there are multiple layers for you to get involved in, and that's why I think in particular why it was like your book is so fascinating, because it adds a new layer which is no code at all. It's like mental model based in understanding this technology and how it applies to people's lives, versus just like a news article like Bitcoin up $10, or something like that. Like it actually shows like
Sure.
how does this affect their lives in a real way.
Sure. I mean, my I don't know if I'd call it a goal of the book, but I suppose one of my purposes for writing it was really to entertain people who had a similar mind of really appreciating mental models. It can be quite frustrating to try and learn about something like Bitcoin when you Google it, right? Because it's like the two paths that you have laid out in front of you are either the really technical path or maybe like the price hype path.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's a third, which is like the culture, like the Twitter Bitcoin culture sort of thing. But it's a little bit tribalistic. So it's like, can you have like this philosophical approach to systems and just appreciate the beauty in them without having to fall into everything that comes with being a part of the tribe.
Is there like a litmus test to tell if you're falling or if you're rising in that situation? How do you ground yourself when you're being hit by that lightning?
The lightning of the tribe is what you're referring to here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I think yeah, I mean, so just innate in us, and like social media brings that out so much, right? It's like maybe less so with Facebook. I don't know because I'm not really on that platform, but every platform sort of has a different way of handling that. I think on Twitter in particular, when there's sort of like this desire for recognition, the desire to be retweeted. It's sort of like inevitable, unless you just don't follow anyone, which is maybe the best approach. It's sort of like, maybe this is just a personal philosophy, but sometimes I feel like when I read other people's books that it's almost like a dangerous thing because it puts an idea in my head that is not my idea. Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult to defend against that for me. And I try to go into it like aware of it. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to like see good ideas and to adopt them into yourself, but yeah, I think it's really hard. I definitely don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, I was thinking that like you kind of like feel the edges of it, where it's like if you're getting into tribalism or not would be like how humble are you? Like if you're struggling with your level of humility and going into a book to make sure you don't lose yourself in the book, like that's probably sounds like you're on the right side of the spectrum, versus going into a book and be like, this is horrible because this is like you're going with preconceived notions based on what you already know. But there's like a balance between like I have the same problem where it's like I'm reading something and to give it like its full weight, I like to think of it as correct from the author's point of view, and then read it and then kind of like break apart the ideas. Like I think of my head, I know it's like all one brain, right? But like I think of it like I take in the information and I have a firewall around it, and then I slowly bring in the information that I'm sure doesn't have viruses in it, and then I apply it to my life using like some of my mental models and stuff to see like is this good, is this not good, is it applicable to different time periods and stuff like that. So
I love that.
yeah,
I love that.
yeah. I don't. A neuroscientist would have to comment on what that actual process is, but that's kind of like how I think about it. I am curious. I know we wanted to touch on the mental models a bit, especially as we're relating to the book, which is a great deal about mental models. But are you consistently making new mental models for different systems, or do you have like an omni mental model that updates and refreshes as you kind of like a tree of life of knowledge that you refresh with new information and new hypotheses to see what's right and what's wrong?
Yeah, I think, so I think the mental model is sort of like the way of framing it where it's like, okay, this thing is like applicable, but more recently I've sort of shifted into thinking more in like symbolic terms. Like you use the term tree of life, and I could think of like, at least 100 different images that come to my mind, and like a whole evolutionary path for that sequence of symbols. So I've been starting to shift my thinking in that direction. Although I would say there's less direct use with that, right? It's more just like it's more of a tool for meaning than a tool for usefulness in a pragmatic sense. But yeah, I think I am always updating my mental models, trying to find new mental models. I think so visually that often I need to draw that out to kind of make that concrete.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a really good memory then?
No, I have a terrible memory.
Really? Like,
yeah.
There's every book I've read on the subject of memory in terms of like how to improve it basically uses some form of visual cue to retain the information. So
that's true.
It's usually like, if you're thinking of the number one, it's like a bunch of snakes is one. And so as you flip through a deck, you can basically have like an animal or something, some really crazy looking thing. So you can memorize, the whole deck of cards. And so if you start from a visual standpoint, I would assume that, you're able to retain the information even better. But,
I mean, I think the only way that I've ever been able to like retain information is if it's not just like data in, it has to be, you have to process the data in some way and put it in your own terms in order for me to stick, to have it in my, have it in my working memory.
Yeah, that makes sense. So is there a mental model you've recently been working on that you can share, like kind of like the process that you went through to making it or developing it?
A recent one. So, I mean, the book is framed with the idea, which I stole this mental model from someone else. It was great. It was like the idea of systems thinking, but not so recent, I would say. I've been thinking so much about symbols that I don't think I have a good mental model to grab from. Writing a little bit of poetry, which I don't know if that's a mental model necessarily. It's just kind of expressing yourself in more of an artistic way instead of the scientific way. So maybe that's why I don't have one readily available, as I've sort of been leaning more into my artistic brain and away from the logical side of it.
It's interesting. Is there a type of poetry that you like in particular?
No, but I mean, like, we're talking about memory, so it's like, and it's like, I think if I can write something that feels extremely meaningful to me, then I'll remember it more, right? Yeah. So in that sense, that's kind of what I mean by more of a poetry way of phrasing it. Yeah, I don't think so.
Well, when we're talking about poetry, there's a quote that pops in my head.
Sure.
But it's like, why does a bird, I don't think it's poetry, but I love the quote, but it's like, why does a bird sing? Or something like that. Like, why does a bird sing? And the answer is like a bird sings because it has a song. So sometimes like, which I like. I think that's like kind of beautiful in itself. But are you posting your poetry somewhere? Is this kind of like an internal thing that you're just enjoying?
I've literally only started like the past 3 days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is just like, I guess I'm just going through this flux in life of feeling a little bit more artistic that way. But yeah, it's a really good way of expression, and absolutely I would share that. It's a little bit easier to share things that are like logical and useful. It's sharing creativity is a much harder thing. Because you don't necessarily see an obvious reason to it. And I love the poem that you shared, because it's like, why does a bird share a song, right? It's because it has a song. It's just because it has one. Because yeah, and humans don't operate that way for a number of different reasons.
Yeah, we're weird. We're a weird species. The
Right?
I There's like, I don't know what I was reading, but it was basically like someone was equating consciousness to like a person screaming in the middle of the night. It's like, I guess. I mean, like, yeah, I mean, other animals that probably don't have consciousness look pretty happy. So like it's like Spider-Man. Like, with great power comes great responsibility. Like, we're aware of our suffering, so we should probably do something about it. But so it seems like we're on similar trajectories, because literally like the last three. Pardon, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that's interesting. You tell me about your perspective on that. What do you mean by that?
Oh, the consciousness as a scream in the dark.
No, the you being on a similar trajectory.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I'm learning art stuff too. Like, I just started learning to draw.
Oh, that's a great skill.
Yeah. Well, it's neat as we talk about mental models and like systems thinking, because now that like I'm learning it's like everything I see, I can deconstruct, and like I see like, oh, it's like three shapes and two lines to like make most things, and it's kind of neat when you look at it from like the building blocks versus maybe like other ways of learning where it's like top down. I don't know if there's other ways of learning, because I'm just learning it from the way that I did research instead of like building blocks on up. And so
Sure.
literally it's like 4 or 5 days I'm into it, and I tried drawing a picture of my wife day one. It is horrible. And so like a month from now I'm going to do it again. And it's just interesting how you can apply that, like the ability to deconstruct and remember things about your environment, like the utility of it, as well as just it's also quite fun. It's like learning it and applying what I'm learning in like a direct way that I can see.
Yeah, I wish I learned how to draw, because I'm like writing a series of books that are all illustrated, and often I'll just like describe the concept and like pass it to an illustrator, and it's usually it's consistently better than I would be able to produce, but I'm envious of her ability to produce it. I know I did try to learn how to draw, right? And like you definitely pick up some mental models there, where it was like one was like seeing the negative space, right? Instead of looking at the object, you look at the negative space around the object. And another really interesting way to approach learning how to draw was to look at how illustrations evolved over time, and how people didn't really understand the concept of like perception in old school drawings, where like the whole idea is like, when you look out onto like a bridge against the ocean or something like that, and you can see it kind of vanishing into a point. It's like the early illustrators like did not see that, or they must have looked at that and saw something different. It's sort of unclear what was happening in the human brain at that time, but they couldn't obviously produce that. It's like when you look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it's all very flat. There's no perspective in it, or very little perspective, other than the making the more important people larger kind of thing.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't know why paintings were like that, or artwork over like the Renaissance. And
It's almost like the first time someone saw the ability to see in a particular way, then everybody was given that same type of vision, right? It's like someone had to do it first. There's like this old story from the Middle Ages, like I don't even know if it's true, but like scribes used to all read aloud, apparently, according to this sort of like old school story that I heard. And one particular monk started reading in his head, and like before that, like nobody knew you could even do that. And it's like, yeah, right. And it's like crazy, because you think of those people as more or less the same. There's definitely people, right? And like it wasn't that long ago, like a little bit more than 1,000 years ago or something like that. So it's just pretty remarkable to think how much one person thinking. Maybe we don't think of those as mental models, but like the ability to read inside your head is like you take that so much for granted.
There are stories of people who went to the doctor because they had voices in their head, and it was just their voice. They were talking to themselves.
Yeah,
and they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what it was. Or how some people see in 2D versus 3D.
Oh, or they close their eyes.
Yeah, when you imagine stuff in your head, some people see in 2D or 3D. Some people only see descriptions of things that come to them.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's like
Sure.
I think dyslexic people see in 3D. I think that's what I was reading.
So I'm pretty dyslexic, and I think that that's true, but I obviously don't know what other people see.
Mhm.
So it's kind of hard to validate.
Yeah, well, I think they did some research on it. For anyone out there that knows the research, or if I'm saying this wrong, just write me a mean email. I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. There's like people see different things,
Well,
but
I believe you.
yeah. I always like the comment section and stuff because if you say something wrong, there's literally a principle around this. I think it's called like Murphy's principles. It doesn't even matter if I say it right because like the principle is if you say it wrong, someone will correct you. Like that's like how you get to the truth. It isn't like saying what you think the closest version of the truth is. It's just saying something egregiously wrong and someone will correct it. Which which is kind of an interesting way to crowdsource knowledge if you don't know what you know. But circling back to I guess let's start at like the blockchain and then work our way down. We talked about Lightning. Are there other trends in this space that you're following that maybe people who aren't as in depth as you are would not be aware of?
Yeah, I would say one would be federations and basically experimenting with the concept of something less decentralized and seeing what trade-offs come when you increase centralization, but it still maintains some level of decentralization. And another would be maybe things like dexes that I find personally pretty interesting. I could probably give different rants about both of those.
So I know what federation is. I'm not familiar with dexes. What's a dex?
Decentralized exchange.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about those two things is interesting you, Erna?
So it's like, I view all of this crypto stuff, if you set aside all the price speculation of it, it's sort of like we're all just experimenting with what could work for new financial rails, right? And that's such a loaded term, right? Because people want to do so many different things inside of the area of finance. So, and it's pretty hard to separate the price aspect from it. But what I think is really interesting about federations is that there's this technology called blind signatures, and that was produced by this guy named David Chaum, like way back when in the 80s. I think that's right, or maybe he just utilized blind signatures. So I might have misspoken. Someone can write me an angry email now. But so there basically, like, what I like to do is like I like to think about what are we inventing in crypto land and how is that a replication of what has existed in the past. So particularly with this idea of using blind signatures and federations, you can come at this idea of Chaumian digital eCash, which basically, like, I'll try and give you the vision instead of explaining the technology. Okay, so I have to like kind of slow down and focus my brain to be able to do that. But back in the day, like we used to go, not we, but other people like used to go to banks, give them the gold, and then they'd get an IOU. And the bank would take custody of your gold and stuff like this. And you would get essentially $1 that you could go exchange around. And that had a number of interesting properties. Like it was lighter than the gold. It was more secure in a lot of senses because you weren't physically holding the thing of value anymore. Like that custody risk was handed off to another party. Mm-hmm. So you could look at those as good or bad things. Like there's definitely good and bad aspects to it. And with federations, what we think we might be able to do is we might be able to hand over our Bitcoin to a federation, and the federation can hand you back an IOU. And what's really cool about this is you're basically replicating the gold model that used to exist with banks, but because it's invented by cypherpunks and not bureaucrats, politicians. We're actually with the use of the blind signature technology, potentially adding another layer of privacy where the bank doesn't actually know who you are or how much you've deposited. So when I look at it in the future, like 50 years or something like that, I'm like, wow, if federations actually not only work, but then people can understand them and start using them, like, what does that world look like? That's pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. So that's one that I think is like endlessly interesting. And then the other being DEXs with this decentralized exchange concept is like, anyone who's kind of dabbled in the crypto world is like, well, if they've only ever dabbled, then they probably bought Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency at an exchange, and their funds are probably still parked there, which means that, you're not holding your private keys. So the exchange is really custodying that for you. And the exchange is a business. So if the government compels them by force to do something, with those keys that are against your interests, they basically have to do that in order to survive. So most of the interesting properties about crypto are not to being taken advantage of or utilized by anyone who's holding their funds in an exchange. So it's like, okay, how do we replicate the idea of an exchange, the ability to have a market for cryptocurrencies without using that centralized third-party company that is beholden to the governments that regulate them? And that's what people are exploring with the DEXs. Another angle that I like, that I think is a unique angle to approach thinking about DEXs is back in the early days of crypto, everyone was creating like forks of Bitcoin, right? So like most people know of Litecoin, and then there was like, I don't know, Feathercoin, and there was just like a series of these. And now that's happening with Ethereum. Occasionally people will change certain properties of the chain to like have some sort of competitive edge or advantage, but like primarily they're taking the code base of those open source chains and just, changing minor things. In the early days, that would be changing things like total supply or divisibility or something like this. And now with Ethereum, maybe they're changing the amount of decentralization that they have, or maybe they're changing a smart contract language or whatever, right? So the thing is like people are creating a whole bunch of these layer ones, and maybe even tokens on top of the layer ones, but that can get pretty complex. So the problem with that from an industry perspective, or you could take it from an investor perspective, is like, how do you value any of these things, right? It's like maybe the value of these things is zero because they're just almost exact replicas of something larger. So what's really cool about the DEX and the innovations there is it's a bit tricky to explain without getting into the technicals of it. But basically, if you don't know what the value of what these coins are, the DEX has helped, I think, determine, if not real prices, like some sort of sane price. Like I'm struggling here with the terminology because none of those words feel exactly right. But basically, you have, in order to sell a coin or a token at an exchange, a decentralized exchange, you have to stake or put up liquidity on this other side of the swap, right? So saying it a different way, if I create like, I don't know, I don't want to be a shitcoiner, so it's like, what am I going to create? Well, somebody creates like, I don't know, what's a silly name for a coin?
Shogun coin.
Shogun coin. Okay, so someone creates Shogun coin, and we don't know what it's worth. A liquidity provider, an investor, or a whale, whatever you want to call them, can put up liquidity on the other side of the swap. So they could like put up Bitcoin or put up Ethereum or whatever it is. And now people can trade between those two assets until liquidity is depleted, right? And like, so you've basically turned something that's essentially vapor. Like you just printed bits and nobody knows what those bits are valued at. And you've created a market price for it. And there's risk to you because you could lose your liquidity in the swap. So it gets really complicated really quickly. But the point of the reason why it's interesting is because we're all trying to figure out what these things are worth. And this is like a decentralized way to figure out what these new protocols are potentially worth. Or priced at, I should say.
Yeah.
Which may be two different things.
Yeah, but it makes sense. It's like, barbed wire for the West. You guys are trying to find a way to like pen in the area so people can settle it versus, shooting each other or like having a Wild Wild West type of feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise it's just like, if you're trying to figure out what something's worth, it was just like, what's the loudest? Like, what do you hear about the most? Like, that's not really real.
Yeah. You could set up like a bot to watch Elon Musk and wait for him to mention one and then start buying.
which is, this is like, it's so speculative, and there's just like, it's kind of bleak at times.
Mm-hmm. Well, this actually, these two topics, centralization and kind of like the gold standard parallelism of Bitcoin, is something that a reviewer of yours wrote about. So it's like it's a little, I'm like a little shoehorning it a little bit, but there's like two lines of inquiry, and they kind of follow those two different trajectories. So we start with like the gold one, but so there's a guy named or person named Kirk on Goodreads, and they asked some really great questions. So Kirk, if you're out there, this is for you. So the first one is, and I'm reading literally what he said or what they said verbatim. So there's a lot of discussion around, and let me know if you want me to just send the text to you, but there's a lot of discussion around the fixed supply of Bitcoin, 21 million or whatever it is, and its benefits. But to anyone familiar with the history of the gold standard, having a fixed 21 million Bitcoin sounds like a harbinger of a future broken economic system. Fixing a currency to a physical and limited asset has been done before. When we had the USD on the gold standard, the system created so much pressure on our economy that one of the most famous speeches in American history was about how the pressure made Americans feel like they were being crucified on a cross of gold. The more people use Bitcoin, the less Bitcoin will be available, which will also apply pressure to the economic system. We went off the gold standard to alleviate that pressure. So how does Bitcoin prevent such a system of pressure from happening again?
Yeah, that's a great question that I often ask myself, actually. And if you find yourself sort of in the middle of the Bitcoin tribe, like it seems like a very obvious question to ask, because nobody else in the tribe seems to be asking it. It's sort of like people are just cheering endlessly for the transition away from the dollar to some sort of like Bitcoin reserve currency, which it's not obvious to me that is all sunshine and rainbows, right? So I'm really happy Bitcoin exists. I'll say that. And I'll say, the inflationary environment that we're in has a lot of obvious flaws, because we're living through that, and like we're kind of watching a little bit of the demise, of this like last rush of fiat, all the money printing that's been going on. But I think what's less obvious to us, because we're living in such a painful time of inflation, especially, in the US, what is it now? Like it's reported at like 7 or more percent. So it's probably really like double that or something. It's less obvious at times like this to see the clear benefits that we've gained from this monetary system. So what that is to me is like, when you print all this money, you get to experiment with a lot of different things in society, or at least what comes to my mind is with tech in particular. It's like how easy it is to fundraise, how easy it is to try your hand at a startup. Like those are all probable gifts of the inflationary environment that we're in. So there's that. And how, if his question is how does Bitcoin solve that, particularly he framed it in more of the statist context, right? So it's like, how does the state survive this? So my understanding of American history was that we were in a lot of debt from the very beginning, just financing war after war after war. And we got kind of lucky in our position with World War II that made us sort of the dominant player that could sort of define the rules of engagement for the way the new monetary system would work after the Bretton Woods Agreement stuff. So I think all we can do is speculate on how this would help. And I'm so cautious around this because I'm not sure that it does. It's like the coolest innovation of Bitcoin is that it cannot be seized from you. And if there's any hope at all, it's good that we have an option for scarce money, but we are not mandated to it in the same way we're mandated to fiat, right? It's like you have to get paid in fiat, you have to get paid in your local government's currency. So it's not really like that's going away. It's just like losing power. And the fact that Bitcoin exists is just giving us a little bit of power back. I don't know if I see a world where everyone makes that the reserve currency, because it, like, as this guy says, it's not in the benefits of the states to do that. maybe it gets a little bit different when you think about the situation that Russia's in, or maybe like these certain Latin American countries. So maybe I should say it's not in the interest of the U.S. government to do that. And I think what we're all underestimating here, there's sort of a built-in assumption with Bitcoiners or people in the crypto industry that the Fed gets weaker as it prints money, but it's not obvious to me that that's the case. When you have an endless supply of money that you can print, it gives you the ability to basically buy everything, right? And like looking at China, you can see this, and looking at the U.S. increasingly, you can see this. I don't know if too many people are aware of this, but I read an article where it was like the Federal Reserve started buying up publicly traded U.S. companies and would not disclose which companies they were. And like the Federal Reserve has historically been fairly transparent, but they're not bound to do so. So, I don't know. That definitely doesn't answer the question to any satisfaction. But I think it's an interesting concept to explore.
Right. I wasn't aware about the Fed buying up and not letting people know what it's doing, because that's like what China does, where they start buying, like they have a stake in all companies.
That's right. Yeah. Oh. Right. So it's like, how do you compete with an North authoritarian regime like I was going to say Canada. I caught myself. No, we're not
enjoying those memes.
Yeah,
those memes. Yeah.
It's how do you compete with an authoritarian regime like China? It seems like the answer the U.S. is taking is to become authoritarian itself, at least in the monetary sense. And if you're familiar with, I think it's called like, oh my gosh, it's like it may be called something as simple as just like monetary theory, but like they have this new monetary theory, which is just nothing. There's really no concept of debt anymore because we could just print money, and that's just like the layman's version of it. But it's pretty horrid what people are up to in the government.
Yeah, I think this situation kind of reminds. I think it's called Hegelian dialectics, where it's like so when there's like two forces and that's not the way to describe it. Someone's going to beat me up, but so there's a like a thesis and an antithesis, and they're like opposites of each other. And when they come into conflict, so like the thesis being like America's system, and then the antithesis being like the Chinese system. And when they come into conflict, they create a blend or a synthesis of the strengths of both into something new. And so basically, whenever, if you want to look at like from a Nietzsche standpoint, like, as you look into the darkness, like the darkness looks into you and it changes like how you do things, like it colors you. And so as like what you're saying, like we look to China, like as we're competing with China and other countries as the United States, like we're synthesizing into something new, and maybe not even in a purposeful way. Just like it's a natural reaction to something when you're trying to win. It starts like bleeding into you.
I think you're right about that. And I mean, China over the past, 20, 30 years has absolutely done that with capitalism.
Yeah.
And now it's our turn to sort of, unfortunately, do that with authoritarianism. And we could all see that a little bit more with some of the COVID stuff that's been going on. And yeah.
I wonder if it's like monocultures. So there was I was reading this. I was reading. Man, I need to like, maybe my memory isn't the best, but it was basically like, how is it that when Rome was finding new cultures and people to trade with, that they all started accepting currencies that Rome would use and use it as like a part of their currency system? Because at first they'd be like, silver was worthless to them in India or whatever. So they'd be like, what? You'll give us like all this stuff for this like worthless silver? Here you go. Get all of you want. And basically over time, they would start seeing the value of silver because Rome saw the value of silver. And so it normalized the value of silver as like a form of like a currency exchange. Sure. And so over time, even though like silver wasn't a form of a currency for them in the beginning, they had other value systems like, like fruit or something else, or like, I think in Japan, like it's the koku, which was like based on rice, like how much rice a person would need for a year. So that like the backing of their systems changed as they were influenced by another system and how well it was successful. And so I wonder, similar to like monocultures, like you drive through the heartland of America, it's just like all the same type of corn. I wonder if like through like these Hegelian dialectics that we're slowly like melding down to like 2 or 3 forms of government and then eventually will just like kind of homogenize into like the worst whichever one is like the biggest, ugliest thing that's able to just like assert its will on the world.
Yikes. Huge yikes. Yeah, I think that's a plausible path that we could walk down. Maybe we're already on it. It's kind of hard to say, right?
Yeah.
I think increasingly like the nation state seems to be less and less meaningful domestically. And it's like maybe the nation state, well, definitely the nation state still has value internationally. But it's like, when to take a concrete example of this, it's like if you were to become the president of the United States, you're supposed to be in like the highest seat of power, but you still, because of the checks and balances system that exists internally to the country, you probably can't do much, right? Like the system, and another way of phrasing this is like the system is so complex, there is no seat of power that's capable of changing it. Not like no singular seat, at least.
Yeah.
But internationally, that's less the case. So yeah, it's crazy stuff that's happening. It's crazy stuff.
Yeah. Hopeful times. It doesn't at all look like 1984 with three powers angry at each other all the time. So Kirk did have another question. There's like a couple of questions in here, so I'm happy to like go one by one. And I think to some extent we've like touched on some of these, but so Kirk, you're getting a lot of mileage right now. But the book discusses centralization of mining servers, which are being consolidated amongst a few companies in a few countries, such as like China. The person says they wish there was a deeper discussion on this, the implications of this, like if Bitcoin network is trustless and decentralized, but depends on a centralized group of miners, what are the potential risks? There's like other questions with that, but we can start there. We can skip to the next question.
Yeah, so I felt that I did go in depth with it, but maybe I was intentionally being unclear because it's like, sometimes you don't want to be too clear because then you have to, it's just too political, right? So as being politically vague. But so the issue that he's asking about is like I would say this was like more of an issue in like 2016 and stuff like that, but there was kind of like this general confusion in the Bitcoin space where that miners had a lot more control that they did. And, necessary technical background of understanding here is that like in Bitcoin, when we say it's decentralized, there's these full nodes that validate transactions that anyone can run and that are distributed globally. And then there's miners that, again, anyone can run. And then you put a little asterisk over that because the asterisk is it's really expensive to like get a hold of these miners. And even if you do have the money to buy them, you're sort of at the will of the manufacturer, and manufacturers tend to be in China, right? And the book was published in 2019, so that was before China had banned mining, which they have since done. So what he's asking about is like, what is the geopolitical risk of all the mining being in China? And I think the simplistic answer to that was, well, there wasn't actually much risk because China doesn't like things they can't control. So like, even if all of the miners were in China, the Chinese government like did not really care about this thing called Bitcoin because it's not interesting to them. It's like, if you have like a giant money printer and you own a portion of every company in your country, like Bitcoin is so different. Like, why would you want to have a piece of that? Like, you don't need it. That I think that's how they view it. So they kick all the mining out of their country. And like, since then, a lot of the mining has moved to Texas and other places in the world, basically places where you can get affordable electricity. So yeah, I mean, if to go down the technical part of this a little bit more, it's like if mining did become really centralized, theoretically, you could execute this thing called like a double spend attack, but it's not in the financial interest of the attacker to do so, generally speaking. So like a concrete example of this would be, it's like if you own 51% of or if you control, I should say that better than more accurate than own. If you control 51% of the hash power of Bitcoin, you would be able to execute an attack where like you send money to an exchange, money in terms of like Bitcoin, right? You send the exchange a bunch of Bitcoin. On the exchange, you go and you sell your Bitcoin, but maybe the transaction on the blockchain sending them the funds hasn't actually confirmed yet, meaning that the miners haven't swept that up into a block, and then sealed it, signed it, mined it. And then when because you're a miner, you can basically just like unwind that transaction, right? And then you'd have the funds from selling the Bitcoin, and you would basically suck back the Bitcoin from the exchange back to you as if it never happened. That's the potential vulnerability if exchanges aren't waiting for multiple block confirmation. So the system of Bitcoin is designed to really make that quite hard, and more than just being hard, it's really not in the advantage of the attacker to execute that. And if mining becomes super centralized to a particular geographical area, we haven't explored the risks of that in this particular rant here, but I don't think it's too much of a concern.
And it's against the attacker's interest in the sense that they would be hurting their like the value of what they've like their 51%, the value of it, or not.
Yeah, so that's right. It's like attack on the network would be bad for Bitcoin. So like, why would they do that? Maybe. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I think that's just the point that I'm making. I'm just sort of like exploring it a little bit more.
Yeah. So I guess I'm like a doomsday prepper in my head where I imagine horrible situations. But what if there was like a little AI bot, and like it doesn't really care how much money it has. It's just its job is like go out and destabilize stuff, and it slowly is able to like acquire 51%, and it doesn't like its job is just to destroy and cause as much havoc. So like kind of like a Joker type person, but like a little AI bot or something.
Yeah. So the cool thing about mining, so now I'm sort of shifting the goalposts here, but I'll say that plainly, is like we're exploring the idea of like what if that happened, but now I have to change the goalposts and say, well, it's very unlikely that is possible to even occur. So like in order to get 51% of the hash power that mines Bitcoin, let's say you're trying to be you're a new attacker and you're not currently mining. Well, in order to get 51%, that means you need to double the existing hash power of mining. So it's like, first of all, that's extremely visible. Like we know what the hash rate is that's contributing to mining. So if all of a sudden somebody just joined the network with twice as much hash power, that we would notice that. Second of all, if it's not really possible to do because there's such a limitation around manufacturing that it would be, even with the ability to just print infinite money, being able to buy that amount of hash power is not something that I think is possible. I don't think states have interest in doing this. I don't think that's the route they would take if they wanted to attack Bitcoin. It's not clear to me that would even necessarily destroy Bitcoin. Like it's complex. But what I will say to the guy who asked the question is like adversarial thinking is like one of the most fun things about these systems. So it's definitely a great question. It's an interesting thought experiment. Thinking about all the different ways you can attack systems is good, and it makes them stronger. So I don't think it's likely, but it's a good line of thought to ask those kinds of questions.
And it sounds like you'd see it coming too, so you could just run away or like get off like sell your stuff or something. Or like counteract it.
Right. Well, so the difficulty increases as more hash power, hash power joins the system. So it's sort of like, it would just be extremely hard to pull this off. Like I don't have the exact numbers. Like somebody should make a website dedicated to this of like how much money would it cost to create a 51% attack. And look at who's actually capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And when I looked years ago, it was like it would be extremely difficult for a single nation state to pull off. So it's a large amount of money.
All right. Well, Kirk, we appreciate that line of question. Hopefully that was a great answer. I think it was, but maybe you'll have a mean email coming our way. But I doubt it. They're very respectful of how they wrote. So moving on to a question I primed you in the beginning of our talk with, which is a bit of a transition, but definitely still talking about politics a little bit. So in your book, you have a bunch of really nice quotes about the Fed. It just, I really think it shows just how much you love the thing. But so like this will be a hard question for you. But like if you had to delete the Fed, how do you think it would affect history? And for anyone who can't tell, I'm joking. All right, but if you could delete the Federal Reserve from ever existing, how do you think it would affect people, personally, or the United States generally, today? So like whenever it was made, like 100 or so years ago, if it just never existed, like how would that affect? Like, yeah,
It's so hard to even speculate, right? It's sort of like speculating like what would the world look like if we never used like natural gas, resources or something like that, or like we never we I don't know. It's so difficult of a concept because then you're basically just like erasing the history of the U.S.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I want to play along because I do think that that's interesting, but it's like if the Federal Reserve never existed, wow. So, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like a lot less interventionism, right? So it's like because if the as we just like talked about before, like if Bitcoin were to if the United States I mean, the first, how do I put this? What we were saying, I mean, the first, losing my train of thought here.
I wish I could read your mind and help. I don't know which way, which.
Yeah, because we were talking about something else that reminded me of where we are now. And it was like, maybe I'll just pick a different train of thought. So like, I mean, the first, hold on, let me think about this.
I believe in you.
Thank you. Hold on. Okay. So when we were talking about the Fed before and Bitcoin, I might need your help here with what train of thought was this? We were just talking about it. Remind me of the question.
Was it shadow buying companies? Was it was it just printing money to buy things so it could buy everything in the world?
No. Okay. Here, ask me the question again, and maybe it'll help me remember where it was.
Where do you think the country would be, or what would the effects be if the Fed never existed? Like if you delete it from history?
God, nope, totally lost this train of thought. It was good too.
Like, would we? I guess maybe to like narrow it down. Would people like let's take like quality of life or something like, or like how do you think people's quality of life like nowadays would exist? Because like the Fed's job based on their website.
Okay, I remember.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for helping me. Yeah, so we talked before about like the history of the United States and what would happen if we all kind of adopted Bitcoin, right? Like if that would be good or bad for people in general. Mm-hmm. And what I was saying before was that, if you look at the history of the United States, like the reason for us getting like away from the gold standard was all the wars that we needed to finance. Like we were in so much debt that we needed a way to kind of break away from that. Which is why, dude, maybe I'm just too caffeinated. Because I keep saying, which is why, and then my brain just like fractures into like a million different paths. Maybe it's such a good question that I can't think of it in anything other than like a fractal.
Yeah. This is one of those situations where like if we had like a brain-computer interface, it would be really cool to see what your brain's thinking of.
Just like maybe.
It's like a kaleidoscope. It's a kaleidoscope and it just has a picture of the Fed and it's in different colors.
Well, it's just such a large question, right? It's like I saw Elon Musk ask a question about how he like, what if you could just remove the ability for oil to exist, like would you do that? And it was like, no, obviously not. And it's like if I were to just unwind the existence of the Fed, it's like the first thing that comes to mind, just saying it plainly without getting into like fractal land, is less wars, right? That in and of itself is like, okay, now who's the dominant power? Is it the middle? Like who in the Middle East has benefited from this? Because it's probably the entire region as a whole is benefited, right? And then does Israel even exist? So it's like you're getting a peek into the fractal here, right? It's like, does the U.S. exist? Does Israel exist? What is happening in the Middle East? How does that affect trade? What has been invented? Everything that's been invented in the United States. Does that exist? Does social media exist? Like, so yeah, it did break me a little bit.
My bad. But
it's a great question though. I just didn't, it's amazing that I haven't asked myself that. I've never approached it from that angle before.
Yeah. Was there a form of the Fed that existed in other countries before we made it? I think the
Uh,
England had a central bank, right?
did England have a central? Yeah, I mean, it did a little bit, but that was like,
Well, I guess
yeah,
I'm curious in the same way that we were talking about Hegelian dialectics. Like, if we didn't have it, was there someone else out there doing it that would then be able to like wage war and innovation that would then like bore to the rest of the planet if we didn't innovate concurrently?
right. I mean, so the banks that existed, to my knowledge, like in England, were all basically tied to monarchy, right? So it actually looked a lot more like China looks because they're all extremely centralized. Like the Federal Reserve doesn't make investments really, or it didn't used to until recently. But the Bank of England was definitely sponsoring all the colonialism that was happening around the world.
Hmm.
So like you could go further back and say like, well, what if that didn't exist?
Yeah.
But then it's there's a whole YouTube channel about this actually, which the guy can clearly walk these thought experiments a lot better than me because it doesn't break him, and he made a whole YouTube channel dedicated to it.
Oh, what is it? I'll check it out.
I'll have to send that to you separately, but it's basically like, what if the other side won the Civil War? Or what if, the US never existed? And then he'll just walk out for like 20 minutes what the world could have looked like in that hypothetical scenario.
Mm-hmm. And for everyone wondering, when we get to the end of the episode, I will say what it is due to magic. So you'll have it. All right, sweet. Then transitioning a little bit, and hopefully this question doesn't cause a similar problem. But like, so for people maybe not familiar or familiar, like there's some Canadian truckers doing some protesting, and the Canadian government, if I'm saying this wrong, like feel free to correct me, but like they're like, we're tired of your shit, so we're taking your money, and they started like raising their accounts. I think like someone like they took like their GoFundMe money as well, and so I'm just wondering like. Generally protesting is a good thing. And so I imagine if protesters, it's basically to ask the question is like, how can Bitcoin or blockchain help protect protesters or well, even union strikers? Like the John Deere was having a strike. And one of the big things was that like, will their war chest survive long enough to irritate this billion-dollar company that even with the strike made like $6 billion in profit? Like how can Bitcoin and blockchain technology enable these protesters like the Canadian truckers or like the John Deere strikers, which they're already over, but protect their war chest and allow them to project their political interests to achieve their objectives?
Yeah, so I think what the framing that you put that in was from the perspective of the Canadian government, right? So it's like, oh, we're tired of your shit. And really it was probably much worse than that because it's like they never say that directly. They say like, all kinds of other things like you're, misogynistic or something like that. Something that doesn't really make sense, but it seems to just be like their line of insult for now. I think the most obvious way is, when you get financially censored like that, it's really a threat against your life.
Yeah.
And we talk about censorship in culture when it comes to like, oh, I got banned from the town square, which I got banned from Facebook, banned from Twitter, banned from speaking, which is already egregious. But like the ability to ban someone's ability to survive monetarily, like their livelihood, like that's so much worse. It's hard to even imagine how much worse, but it's like, yeah, you can't survive like that. So it's a threat against your life. That's how I would take it. Yeah. I did see that in regards to the truckers in particular, that I think it was the state of New Mexico, the governor of the state of New Mexico has offered practical asylum to people who were in Canada suffering this. So the obvious answer for Bitcoin and why a lot of the donations have been happening in Bitcoin is because when you donate the Bitcoin, that can't be seized from you. But they can make it extremely difficult. They can try and track you. So like it's still not perfect, right? But if it's probably the best lifeline that we got right now to being able to survive in some capacity. And, people, more importantly than just financial survival, is like people showing their support. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you find yourself in a situation like that where someone is attacking you monetarily, it can feel, I mean, that's so extremely isolating. So for the ability for people to be able to establish a community around you and send funds to you when you've been banned from all the different platforms it's a way of reintegrating that person into society to some degree. How useful it is to actually buy things is sort of another question, right? It's like, it's not like those people can go and turn around and like pay their rent because they're, especially if their name has been dragged through the mud. So it's good that it exists, but it's not enough. It's not enough. So
It reminds me of, you know, about 100 years ago, when people would protest or strike in America, like they deployed the National Guard on them. You know, like the people literally died for like the 40-hour work week or having lunch. And I hear about people all the time being like, "Oh, I'm not going to have my lunch. So I'm going to make an extra like $7 an hour." It's like, I mean, I get, you know, I you know, not to put down, like I guess that $7 is very important, but it's like people died so you could have it. And then like they're just like they slowly due to pressure put these safeguards in because people are saying like, hey, we don't want these types of things because these protesters and stuff say it's really important. And then like over time, it's like people forget how important it is. And so they're like, well, if you don't want lunch, we'll just take that away as an option. You can just work 8 hours a day and come home and be tired and stuff like that. So, so it's like a similar thing. Like if they don't have the money to survive, it's just like a slow death. Which is kind of ironic because like, I think it was like 6 months ago, like wasn't like the Canadian Prime Minister apologizing because they just found like 1,000 dead Native Americans in their schools or something. Wow. So you think they would like maybe be nicer to people in the public, but so I guess like if you had to like do a protest or something like that, I imagine it'd be like blockchain focused, like with this type of technology. So you would have the insurance against a central agent disliking what you're doing. In that way.
The philosophy of cypherpunks, which is like the developers and cryptographers that build and work on Bitcoin, is that it is its own form of protest to be working on these systems. That's it, right? It's like it's protesting out in the street, protesting by, you know, joining the government. Like maybe those are valid ways of achieving your path in life, but like the way that cypherpunks view it is you protest through code. And maybe protest is even the wrong word a little bit. It's like you could phrase it a different way and you could say you don't protest, you build the new thing. It's like, don't criticize the thing that exists, just build the better thing. But yeah, it's really hard when you're protesting against nation states. It's not like we can go just like to Mars.
Yeah, not yet. Elon's working on it. All right, so I am curious, like taking this to, I think extremes are fun, you know, but like if all of our digital lives were decentralized, how do you think that would impact? So like, let's say over the next 10 years, we go from like I would say like 90% centralized. I don't know what the ratio would be to being like 100% decentralized in our digital lives. Do you see any overtly positive things that would come from that, or overtly negative things that would become from having like 100% decentralized digital life?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're just looking at crypto from like a superficial lens, like the word decentralization seems so positive, especially when we're surrounded by centralized entities, that like that makes sense as a valid question. But like when you live your life building these decentralized systems, like you see all the downsides of it more closely. And it's like things like key management, things like the cost of decentralization. Like I think that would be tremendously expensive. So I hope that I'm wrong and that we find ways to, like in the case of federations, we find ways to balance centralization and decentralization in a way where we can get the most productive properties of self-sovereignty out of them without all the costs.
So basically things would cost more and maybe be slower because of the bandwidth on the network.
Yeah, it's like a really simple example is like, you know, like when you go to like buy a coffee or whatever, like you're not really, I can't recall who pays the fees in that scenario, but it's like a minuscule amount of fees for you to swipe the card. It's probably the merchant that pays.
Yeah, I think the merchant does.
Yeah, and like with crypto, it's like maybe you're paying a transaction fee, and the transaction fee is increasing based on the demand of the space on the chain. So it can get really expensive. And like, you know, maybe it sounds boring to say that it's expensive, but if everyone goes to make transactions at the same time because of some geopolitical event that's occurring, that's a really big problem. You don't want to disenfranchise the bottom rungs of your society because they can't afford fees, right? So it's I'm really glad crypto exists, but there's still a long way to go and a lot of different ways to innovate here.
Yeah, I think like to answer the gentleman's question earlier, like how does the Bitcoin alleviate the similar pressures like the gold standard? It sounds like it's like a balanced diet. Like before like previously we're just like all on like potatoes, and now we're getting like meat and steak and some other options in there, so we can have a balanced diet in our financial lives. So it's not,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Yeah. All right. So coming to our last few questions, I'm always curious, like especially people who are great self-learners, right? Like you went from zero to just figuring this out, and you had a community around you, of course, of people that you could ask questions to. But I'm curious, if you had to take someone today and take them from like zero to being effective or being a part of the space in some way, and they assuming they start with your book and content, the YouTube channel, everything, check out the show notes. Like, how would you build that person to being effective? Like, what books would you recommend? What things would you suggest they do? Kind of like a build, like a Build-A-Bear for like figuring out like their way through this space.
I think I respect people's agency too much to answer that question super directly, because it's like I don't know what the industry needs, but I think taking a more maybe philosophical approach to it is like, you as an individual are probably the best person to say how you could contribute, right? And I don't know what that is, but you might. And if there's something about crypto or Bitcoin that just draws you in inexplicably, like you should definitely pursue that and understand if this is something you're just interested in because of number go up, or if it's something you're interested in because you want to pursue it and like contribute to it. So yeah, I mean, reading Bitcoin Clarity is great. I'm working with a company, Chain Code, on building a developer course. And potentially that it would start off as like a course for developers and UX designers, and then split off into like 2 different tracks. So I think you can apply for that on their website, or you will be able to shortly. But I've talked to a number of people who are like, hey, like I am in Ireland and I want to, really get my local politicians to understand this. And like, you or I don't know the path for that, but they might. So the big important thing is like understanding enough about the properties of the system and understanding enough about crypto that you feel confident using it. I personally believe you don't need to be a developer to understand these things, and figuring out what you want to contribute.
I think I agree and echo your sentiments in that if you have your North Star, why you want to do it and what your goal is, you can cobble together what you want to learn around that. You can ask very specific questions instead of, how would I learn Bitcoin, right? It's like, how would I learn this very specific point of this, or like what's something that you're not understanding, so you can ask like a 2-second like question to an expert. And I email people all the time, and if you can ask a very specific question that shows that you did your homework, like I think I don't think I literally have like a 99% or 100% response rate from like everyone who will appreciate you not wasting their time and asking a very specific question. So I echo and like share a little bit of my experience in that if you do your homework and you know what you're doing and you run into a problem, and this assumes that you're just kind of like lone wolfing it, which it's probably better to like join a community, a Discord or something as well. But it'll be much easier because then you can ask questions to help yourself along the way.
Yeah, and if you can, like some actual advice is like, to go to local meetups, because that's how I've met so many of the people. And their community can exist in a number of different ways, but yeah, going to local meetups, trying to find a way to contribute to those. I would go to local meetups, and then someone asked me to build a website, and the next thing you know, I'm like working at different Bitcoin companies. So it can just happen in odd ways that you would not expect.
I'm always surprised, for anyone who's looking in at startups or anything, and they're like, oh, I have to have X, Y, and Z to even like approach them. Like there's usually like some type of credential or some type of like experience they need to have before they even will allow themselves to fully try to do the thing that they would love to do, like to learn about Bitcoin and learn about cryptocurrencies, wherever it is. It's a big surprise, because I used to be the same way, how little you actually need to know in terms of like, do your homework, do your work, but then, try, meet people, ask great questions. and put yourself out there. I've noticed, especially in people who email me from the show, a lot of people think that they need to like get a PhD to like do X, Y, and Z and stuff like that. And it's really, if you have the interest and the passion and you're doing the work for it, you're already doing enough. Then just put yourself in a position where you can actually do something useful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyone new listening in, hopefully that helps you. So then I think like 2 or 3 questions left. So we've been talking about questions for you to answer. So I always love to ask this question, which is, what's the question that you do not have the answer to? Like a specific one that you'd love the answer to, like maybe someone listening in could write you in or something like that.
Well, so we did have the one question that I asked earlier on, which is like, I don't know the exact amount of money that it would cost to execute a 51% attack. And it would be really cool if like a live website existed for that would just constantly update based on the existing hash power and the cost, right? So you'd have to do an approximate cost because that's based on electricity or something. But that, to me, that would be such a cool website. It would 100% drive traffic to that.
Sweet. All right. Anyone who makes that website, you let me know, and I'll send it around, and we'll. So basically, this is like if you want to like get in the industry a little bit and get some exposure and kind of do something kind of neat, and you can call it, Bitcoin breakdown or something fun. Then I
have another one actually. It's a bonus now.
Yeah.
Another one is it's impossible to know how many Bitcoin users there are, right? And like because one wallet doesn't equate to one user, and it would be really interesting if all the exchanges in some capacity pooled their data, and then because you imagine that one user probably has access to multiple exchanges, and if we could actually get an understanding of the approximate amount of like Bitcoin holders, like that would be fascinating, although it's probably impossible. It's in the category of unknown unknowables.
Is it a part of the benefit of the system to not know it? Like to make it unknowable?
Yeah, it is.
So it's kind of like you want to look behind the curtain of Oz.
Yep. It would be really interesting to see like how that grows over time, what brings people in. It's like the way I think about it is like every time there's like a hype cycle. Mm-hmm. So anytime the price just rallies really hard, like a bunch of people come in during that. But also you lose a lot of people with that because people sometimes buy in at the top because of FOMO or whatever, and they like never want to buy Bitcoin again or something. So it would be really interesting to see the cycle of how usage, what drives usage outside of places like the US where it's simply just price. Looking at countries where they're using crypto for just basic survival, like that to me is really interesting.
That's an interesting question. So if anyone has, you could make another website where they approximate that number somehow. We will check it out. At one point in time, I swear you were talking about making another book. Are you still doing this? Are you still writing one?
I am, except for it's slow going because I'm writing like multiple books in parallel now.
Well, what are we? Can we get teasers for them? Like what are like the concepts?
So one of them is called Crypto Chaos, which is just like only roughly outlined, and like I want to explore like deeper concepts in the crypto space that go beyond just the simple like why Bitcoin, how Bitcoin. I want to do sort of like a lot like this conversation, like talking about federations, understanding what types of things could exist in the future, potentially the risks associated with decentralized systems that we may not be considering. Like, decentralized systems are basically databases that we can never shut down. And that is thinking adversarially about these systems is a really good time for me. So that's what Crypto Chaos will be about. And then I'm starting a series on myths and just basically reading cuneiform tablets and pulling things from history. And I've got this whole Excel spreadsheet going of like on one axis, I have all the different geographical locations of interest. And then on another axis, I have all the most important events in history. And then I'm kind of like seeing, if you can imagine like a spotlight moving over the globe of all of human history as time passes, you kind of weave that together in some sort of narrative where the cool stylistic part of the series, I think, is that, it'll be one story that bleeds into the next for the next book. So it's like, in particular, I like to use this as an example, but like maybe one book in the series is about Solon and, his contribution in ancient times. And then the story ends with him meeting Aesop, and then the next story would be about Aesop and Aesop's fables. And if you could do all of human history that way, like if I have enough life, that would be what that series would be about.
So kind of like a Baird like a Baird sitting around a campfire telling the stories of humanity through myths.
Well, I guess it's not limited to myths, right? So it starts with myths, which is like why that's on top of mind. But
Okay.
it would start with myths and then kind of go into legend, and then it would go into like ancient history, and then Middle Ages and Enlightenment to modern. One person, what following particularly like the hero of the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely know how you could start the book, which is like the opening to Lord of the Rings. You know, some myths become legends, some legends become lost. You know, whatever it is. That'd be a great opening.
Oh, that's funny. It's actually, now that you mentioned that, I'll shout this out. But I'm working on another book with some cryptographers called, I think we're going to call it the Shamir Secret Share Codex. And the reason why you reminded me of that is because I think we want to put a quote in there from the Lord of the Rings, which is like, keep it secret, keep it safe.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the idea is that you can take a secret and using no computers at all, you can turn that, just like with dice and these things called baubles, which are like paper computers. You can split the secret up into multiple parts, or you could say N of M parts, and then you can reconstruct those the parts to reconstitute your secret.
Mm-hmm.
So, but those are the projects. So they're all slow going. But if you have a preference for one of those, I really should start a better mailing list. Right now, the only mailing list that exists is the one at getbitcoinclarity.com.
I like myths. I also like cryptids because I think they're neat. I've wanted to for some time. There's like this guy on YouTube who gets like a GoPro and he goes and interviews like Amish people or something, and he just like he talks to them and lets them tell their stories from their point of view. And I've loved the idea of just going to small towns and like talking to like a pub owner, like the cemetery person, like the funeral home director, and then like someone from the city office, and then have them tell the story of the town, and then like overlay the different message of them, like because like those three people would see different aspects of each town, like those three types of people. So I like myths, like trying to find like the story of people. That's kind of like fascinating to me. But I read all of them if you need a beta reader or something.
Yeah, I think my favorite are the origin myths.
Mm-hmm.
How the understanding the universe and Genesis, or even just like the creation. I heard a really cool one recently where it's like, I think a lot of people who like myths are familiar with like the Greek myths, and like everything comes out of chaos. Then you have like Gaia, Mother Earth, and all this stuff. And recently I heard of this other god who's not mentioned in most of the tales of the myth, but his name is her name is Ananke, and basically it's like the driver of fate, right? It's like chaos mixed with fate is what caused the earth and sky to separate. And it's like not faith as in being faithful, but like fate as in like destiny.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I love this stuff. It's really, really interesting. It's amazing that the way that the human psyche tried to figure out the cosmos also lines up with science in a lot of ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like animals only have their instincts to to a great extent, their instincts to navigate the world and figure out like what's right and what's wrong. And so even when we didn't have the scientific method or today's availability of discerning what's true and not true, sometimes I wonder if like our instincts were powerful enough to kind of deduce what was there, even though we didn't have an ability to like abstractly describe what is there.
Yeah. I sometimes am a bit envious of like old school ancient Greek philosophers, because it's like they didn't really need the validation of things like scientific papers, and like they in order to feel like their theory was valid. Like Plato would just like make a theory about what constituted the universe, and like his mind was enough in his opinion. He doesn't need all the fluff that we need to go through today in order to convince yourself that you're onto something.
Yeah. There's if you're interested in creation myths, like this isn't a real one. This is the one like related to Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
You can read like the Silmarillion, but there's a guy named Evan Palmer. I mean, I literally just looked it up because I want to make sure I say it right. he made a graphic novel. It's about the creation of, Arda, like the whole world, and it is so beautiful. Like, I've emailed this guy about getting a copy of it, and he doesn't do it because he's afraid he's going to get sued. But it's so I'll like send it to you. But like it's basically like the Bible, but it's really nice because like the J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Christian, and so you have similar like all of the universe was basically sang into being. It's quite nice.
I love that. Yeah, do send that.
And that was Kira Bickers, and this is the Learning with Lowell show. And just, little bit of podcast magic. The name of the YouTube channel that we were talking about is called Alternate History Hub. Check the show notes. It'll be there as well. If you liked this episode, if you hated this episode, if you want to hear more about this topic or a different topic, message me, add a comment. I'm very receptive to these things. You can find us at learnwithlowell.com.